Greetings, fellow Insomniacs, and welcome to Insomniac Gaming Theater. I'm your host, the Crazy Player. To our advanced modding for a secondary weapon video. If you saw the advanced modding for a primary weapon video, there's going to be a lot of overlap here, but there are a few things that are specifically different, and we should talk about them. Let's begin with the things that are most similar. We're going to start with Exilus mods. Every secondary weapon in Warframe has a certain number of slots for them, that being 8 plus an Exilus slot. Now, the Exilus slot is locked by default, which means it has to be unlocked either by building/buying an Exilus adapter, or, buying them. You can purchase one for platinum, and honestly, for the resource cost, it's probably more efficient to use platinum to do it. That's a whole other conversation we'll explain some other video. And that always brings up the question of, is it worth it? Because no matter what we do, we have a limited maximum capacity here. And even if we can get the Exilus to match the polarity that's in the slot, you have to be able to make it make sense with all of the other stuff you're putting on the weapon. So is it worth it? Well, it depends on the weapon and the Warframe. So as you can see here, I have slotted into this particular weapon, which is the Lex Prime, the Suppress mod, which reduces the chance of the enemy hearing gunfire by 100%. Now, if you are using the Warframe Avara, which is where her stealth is dependent upon your weapon being silenced or else your invisibility is disrupted, then this mod is indispensable. It must be on any weapon that is not silent innately, which the Lex Prime is not. But as you can see, we have a ton of other options here. Projectile speed, weapon recoil, additional zoom. Don't use this. Reloads part of the magazine when holstered. Ammo mutation. There are a great deal of options here. Overall, the question of whether or not you should use an Exilus mod is very dependent on the circumstance in which you are using the weapon. So the Warframe, the mission that you're doing, things like that. In general, though, the answer to do you need an Exilus mod is probably no, you don't. I'm not saying never use them. I very definitely do. But that is circumstance dependent. If you find yourself struggling and you're like, oh, I can't afford to build one or I can't afford to buy one, then don't sweat it. They're not absolutely necessary in all circumstances. It is a thing that should be carefully considered per weapon and per Warframe basis. So look at what the mod does, and if you have the capacity, maybe test it out and then decide if you really need it. Because I will also mention, this does not affect the way the weapon sounds to you, just to the enemy. Moving right along to everybody's favorite type of mod to argue about, Bane mods. In this case, they're called Expel mods because that's what they chose to name them for secondary weapons. It's the same thing. These are faction mods. They do additional damage to a specific faction. In the case of the mod I'm highlighting, Grineer, but there is one for Grineer, there's one for Corpus, there's one for Infested, and I think there's even a Bane mod for the Corrupted. If you watched the advanced modding for a primary weapon video, you already know what I'm going to say, but I'm going to cover it here. Because of where these work in the damage calculation, they can be very powerful. And to briefly sum it up, there is base damage, there's elemental damage, there's critical damage, all of these things. And then at the very end of that calculation, that's where Bane mods go. So when this says plus 30% damage to Grineer, that means after base damage, after elemental damage, after critical damage if you got a critical hit, and so on and so forth. Under the right circumstances, this can be huge amounts of damage. That's the good news, is when they work, they are tremendously effective. And there are primed versions of these mods that give huge bonus damage. The bad is they are specific to a type of enemy, as it says. Expel Grineer. So if you're shooting at a Corpus enemy, this mod does nothing. And since we only have 8 mods plus an Exilus, you're constantly having to ask yourself, is this mod worth the space on this weapon? And every single time you go to fight another faction, you have to change the Exilus mod. Or you have to have a different configuration for each faction, and you have to remember to swap it every single time you face a different faction. That's the bad. And then we come to the ugly, which is, at this point, the game has expanded so much that there are a number of factions that do not have faction mods that grant additional damage against them. For example, the Thrax enemies, which you encounter on Duviri and another location that is a spoiler. They, as far as I know, do not have a faction mod that affects them. So if you wanted to use this sort of a mod against them, you simply cannot, because the mod does not currently exist in the game. So that's the ugly. Are the Bane mods good? It is, much like the Exilus mods, very dependent on circumstance. If you know for a fact you're going to be fighting a very tough enemy of a particular faction, then a Bane mod may be worthwhile. But if you're just running through levels, gunning down random enemies, the answer is probably not. Overall, I personally do not use them. I usually opt to do additional elemental damage because I find that to be more universally applicable. Your mileage may certainly vary. I'm simply trying to give you the information to make an informed decision for yourself. Now we're going to move on to a mod that has a certain parallel to a primary mod, but has a number of distinct differences that matter very, very much, and that is Hemorrhage. Hemorrhage says, impact status effects have a 30% chance to apply a slash status effect, and then 2 times when fire rate is below 2.5. Don't worry about that part. I mean, it matters, but what we're going to discuss is what is good about this mod and then how it significantly differs from Hunter Munitions, which is the primary mod that this is most often compared to. What's good about this is that slash status effects, or bleed as it is more properly known, inflicts a damage over time, or dot, that does a percentage of the amount of damage you would have done to the target before armor. And slash procs bypass armor, which means that if you hit an armored target, mostly the Grineer, with a slash proc, it does damage directly to their health, bypassing their armor, which is the vast majority of their damage reduction. And when we say damage reduction, I need to make it clear that we are talking about there are many Grineer enemies who are walking around with 99% or greater damage reduction, which means you are doing a tiny fraction of the amount of damage you would otherwise do, because of the amount of armor that they have. So the ability to inflict slash upon them and have a damage over time, often, since it bypasses armor, the very first time they take bleed damage will kill them, because since it bypasses their armor, it does so much damage it immediately annihilates their health. That's the good news. The bad news is hemorrhage only works on weapons that have innate impact damage on them. So you see impact damage over here. This weapon, the Lex Prime, does have it. And in fact, we use hemorrhage on the Lex Prime. But you'll notice that it has a great deal more puncture damage. Because of that, the only time we use hemorrhage is when there is an outside factor that makes it worthwhile to use. In this particular case, it is the matter that this weapon has an Incarnon form, and in the Incarnon form, as you can see here, not only does it have impact and then radiation, but not listed here is the fact that shots in the Incarnon form are guaranteed to proc impact, which then gets us slash procs with hemorrhage. Hunter Munitions, which is the primary weapon version of this mod, is on any critical hit. So it is much more universally applicable because, except for a tiny fraction of weapons that are status heavy, we put critical chance on virtually every primary weapon. Hemorrhage is much more niche. It absolutely requires that whatever you are firing has a high chance of inflicting an impact status proc. Also, it's kind of a band-aid, because basically what it's saying is it's taking a bad status type, that is to say impact, and changing it to a good status type, that is to say slash. And many of us in the community are like, well, what if we just made them all good? But that's a whole other conversation. In any case, if you are using a weapon that does not have impact damage on it, hemorrhage is a complete waste of time. You have to look at what the weapon does very carefully and very specifically. Next, we're going to discuss the galvanized mods, because as you can see here, we have a couple of them. And that's going to lead us very, very briefly into a discussion of Steel Path, because these are bought using Vitus Essence, which you get from arbitrations, which you can only unlock if you have done every node on the regular star chart. That is also what unlocks Steel Path, although arbitrations are technically distinct from Steel Path. They both have the same unlock condition. Now, Galvanized Diffusion has become the standard for anyone who plays at that level. Once you have the option to unlock this mod, you put it on and you basically forget Barrel Diffusion exists. Why? Because even though Barrel Diffusion at static has 120% multi-shot, Galvanized Diffusion says that you get 110% multi-shot, but an additional 30% multi-shot for 20 seconds stacks up to 4 times. So that is, if you have killed at least 4 enemies, that is an additional 120% multi-shot, which allows you to kill some of the less powerful enemies, like, say, butchers, who tend not to have a lot of armor and tend to go down very easily, and then use the weapon to shoot and kill bigger, tougher enemies, such as, if we're sticking to the Grineer faction, bombards, who tend to have quite a lot of armor. You get quite a lot of multi-shot. In addition to that, not every shot lands on the same enemy. It depends on what weapon you're firing. This has become the standard. Once you can get this, this is universally what we use instead of Barrel Diffusion. And for the same reason, because more multi-shot is never a bad thing. Galvanized Shot, which comes from the same place and requires Vitus Essence to buy, is a much more niche mod. And part of that is because the way it works is wildly inconsistent. So the static part is actually very straightforward. It gives plus 65% status chance. That's because I don't have it maxed up all the way. I don't need to. It already does more than what I need at 8. It also says plus basically 33% direct damage per status type affecting the target for 14 seconds stacks up to 3 times, which is basically another 100% damage at this level. If I pushed it up to maximum, it would be like 120, because that seems to be what the combination is. It is 120. As I said, this mod is somewhat niche for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it only goes on weapons that have very high status chances, such as, say, the Kuva Nukor, which is a status monster that puts huge numbers of statuses on enemies. Secondly, it does not go on anything that has an explosive component. If a weapon causes an explosion of any type, we do not use galvanized shot, generally speaking, because the bonus to direct damage, the bonus to damage says direct damage, which means when you hit the target with the projectile, it does not affect explosive damage at all. And then the last part that makes this so niche and so varied is where it goes in the damage calculation, where the bonus damage goes. The status chance is always in the same place, but where the bonus damage goes varies from weapon to weapon. In some weapons, it acts like a base damage mod like Hornet Strike. So it goes on at the beginning of the damage calculation and affects status damage and things like that, which is nice but not super powerful. Some cases, it goes on like a status mod, and so it takes the base damage and then calculates how much additional damage it does based off of that. And sometimes it works at the end of the damage calculation like a Bane mod and yields huge, stupid numbers of damage. What weapon does it do what on? I don't know. It like I said, it is wildly inconsistent. So generally speaking, we use it on, say, the Kuva Nukor, but other than that, you really have to take it and test it and see what it does. So I'm not saying don't use galvanized shot or that it isn't worth it, but it is a wildly inconsistent mod. And if you can only afford to buy one galvanized mod from the vendor, diffusion is where you start. This is a luxury. Next, we're going to talk about the auger mods. Now, these you get, if I remember correctly, you get these from Plains of Eidolon. Enemies there drop them. There are a number of them. They go in different places. This is the one that goes on the secondary weapon, though, so we're going to talk about this very, very briefly. So first and foremost, Auger Pact says plus 90% damage. This is exactly the same kind of bonus that you get from Hornet Strike, only Hornet Strike says 220% damage. These two things do stack with each other, but they stack additively. So if you put this on, say, if you put both of these on, okay, so 90 plus 220 is 310% damage. So it takes whatever these numbers were at base and adds 310%. Okay, it does not take the 220% and then say, okay, take 90% of that bonus and add it on. So you start to run into diminishing returns where the use of the amount of damage that you're getting out of this mod is not nearly as important as the amount of damage you're getting out of this mod. This is the fact that these two add together is the thing that we're going to talk about again in just a little bit. The primary reason we would actually use Auger Pact here is not for the 90% damage. It is for converts 80% of energy spent on abilities into shields. If you are playing a Warframe where refreshing your shields is important to your survival, and there are several of them, then this is very important because it means every time you use one of your abilities, you help refresh your shields. The main reason we use this mod and anything else that says Auger on it, on say a secondary weapon, is because it helps refresh our shields. We are not, generally speaking, interested in the primary effect of, say, the 90% damage. That's not to say it's never useful, but we are almost always after the shield benefit, not the primary stat listed here. And you'll notice that there is the potential to have up to 6 of these mods scattered between your Warframe and your weapons. Overall, again, it is the part of the reason why we're discussing these in an advanced separate video as opposed to the basic video is because these things are much more circumstantial. There are some circumstances where they're vital and absolutely necessary, and other circumstances where we just don't bother with them. Moving along, and the last thing we're going to talk about here is the secondary arcane. These you get from Steel Path, actually from Steel Path. You earn Steel Essence to buy the ability to even put the arcanes on from Teshin. You use Steel Essence to buy those. And then you get the arcanes themselves pretty much universally from killing acolytes in Steel Path. If you guys want a video about how to do all of that, let me know. We can absolutely do that video. The secondary arcanes that get used most often are secondary Deadhead, secondary Dexterity, and secondary Merciless, and they all do basically the same thing. Secondary Merciless says, on kill, add 30% damage for 4 seconds, stacks up to 12 times, which is 360% additional damage. Secondary Dexterity says, on melee kill, add 60% damage for 20 seconds, stacks up to 6 times. Again, 6 times 6 is 36, so 360. And they each have a rider effect, faster reload speed, additional combo duration, or, in Deadhead's case, on precise headshot kill, 120 damage for 24 seconds, stacks up to 3 times. So again, 360% damage, plus 30% headshot multiplier, minus 50% recoil. So these are the ones that are used most often, and they all have the same benefit and the same basic problem. First and foremost, they are base damage. So like I was talking about just a minute ago with Augur Pact, they are the exact same kind of damage benefit that Hornet Strike is. They increase the base numbers of how much damage that you do, from which then elemental mods are calculated and things like that. Then the question becomes, if the weapon can kill enemies before the damage that these sorts of arcanes do is added, then do we really need the arcane? Because if it's already doing enough damage to kill the enemies, do we really need 360% additional damage to kill said enemies? And again, it comes down to, sometimes it's easier to pick off a few low-level enemies and then turn around and hit the big enemies with the additional damage. Especially when you get to higher levels of the game where you're facing very high-level enemies. I'm talking about enemies, in the hundreds of levels. The difference in how difficult it is to kill the quote-unquote fodder enemies and how difficult it is to kill the big end game or the big tough enemies can be quite a large difference. Sometimes, though, you want these things less for the direct damage benefit and more for the rider effects. Minus 50% recoil is not bad. Plus 30% reload speed is not bad. And because these are their own separate slot and do not compete here, sometimes this is the best way to accomplish that sort of thing. And more damage is never really bad, but it is kind of a win more effect, if you understand what I'm saying. If you could already kill the enemies, do you really need more damage to kill the enemies? Does sort of depend on the weapon and where you are using it. And if there's one message I can leave you with at the end of this video, it is that aside from galvanized diffusion, pretty much all of these things are very context dependent. Do we use this? Well, it depends. What is it we are trying to accomplish? That's why this is the advanced video. There is a baseline. Here, let me show you what my baseline. This is the build that I use for most of running around and fighting enemies with the Lex Prime. And this is specifically with the Incarnon Lex Prime. I threw Suppress on here because why not? I could. I had the capacity to do it. I use an Arcane. I don't use a base damage mod. I do use Hemorrhage. But this is a build specifically built around the fact that I am using the Incarnon version of this weapon. If you are using the regular version of the Lex Prime, then your mileage may very definitely vary. The important part for me is that you understand what these mods do so that you can make an informed decision about when to use them and when not to use them. We need to think critically about these kinds of mods because they're not automatically included in every single weapon build. They have specific uses under specific circumstances. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. If they are complex enough, they may end up getting their own video, because comment sections can only handle so much. I thank you very much for joining me for this video. I hope to see you next time, and until then, get some rest. Thank you for joining us at Insomniac Gaming Theater. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment, and if you're so inclined, check out the Patreon in the link down below.